You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Zoe Williams, columnist at The Guardian, and writer Benedict Spence. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Guardian leads on the Prime Minister considering a one-off cash offer for nurses ahead of ministers' meeting with health unions tomorrow. Not a spare in the world reads the front page of the Metro as they picture a smiling king in Sandringham. The Daily Mail reports on Prince Harry's television interview accusing his family in the pain and suffering inflicted on his wife. The Financial Times shed light on US and Japanese forces preparing for a possible conflict with China. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by writer Benedict Spence and Zoe Williams, columnist at The Guardian. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the Metro and their headline there, "Not a spare in the world." Charles greets crowd as Harry hits out on TV. Benedict, you take us into this first of all.
Yes, this is the news. I'm not sure if it is news so much that the king has put on a brave face today whilst meeting people at Sandringham in preparation, if you like, for the documentary, for the interview rather, that's come out this evening and that everybody seems to have watched. Everybody's talking about on Twitter. Prince Harry talking about everything that's going on with his new book. I think it's perhaps wise that the king simply smiled and was polite to people, because it seems that every time a royal does an interview, it seems to lower the public's estimations of them. So, I leave it up to other people to sort of read the front pages and look at the the interview if they have. But it continues the spiral of rather unedifying headlines that are coming out about this book, about what Harry has to say about members of the royal family, who I think are very wisely keeping stum about all of this. I'd be curious to know what the reception is broadly from people who I know who have read or watched whatever it is Harry has to say. The response is not positive, but there is always that question, isn't there? Is this really for the UK, for UK consumption? Is this in fact meant for the audience across the pond in the United States? That is, of course, where he stands to make most of his money. That is where I think he's a lot more popular. We wait to see whether or not that this interview will be a success, whether or not this book will be a success, although I'm sure that they'll have many eyes on both.
Yes, many more revelations are coming to the fore, Zoe, but what is unlikely to happen is that there will be any response from the palace.
Well, yeah, that's why I think this headline was a bit called in, really, because when, King Charles has spent his entire life smiling through events. Like, in what possible world is he going to do anything other than arrive in front of a crowd and smile? I don't think it really tells you anything about his state of mind, and I don't think it really tells you anything about his, hunch around Harry's book and the revelations in it. I'm not wild about the wordplay either, because it's not completely obvious what they're talking about. So yeah, I don't think this is a brilliant capsule of what's going on in the royal family, but I doubt we're going to get that. There isn't any plausible response from the firm, as it were. And Harry is obviously determined to tell everybody absolutely everything.
Yes, and we read in the Daily Mail, Benedict, his quote, well, we believe a direct quote from Harry: "My family helped drive out Meghan."
I think just on the subject of King Charles, I think if anybody wanted to get a quote from him on anything, you'd be better off talking to him about homeopathy or wool. Then you wouldn't be able to get him to shut up. But, on this sort of subject, I doubt you're going to get anything at all. I'm more than prepared to believe that Meghan had a very difficult time when she arrived in that family. It is famously not an easy set to penetrate. But I go back to what I just said, which is that every time a member of the royal family, and it does tend to be members of the royal family who are on the out, give these kind of interviews, they in fact make their own public perception a lot worse. And I think actually that Meghan has done that with her interviews with Oprah Winfrey and her podcast series. I don't think actually, certainly in the UK at least, I don't think she has improved the image. And many people who might have been prepared to say yes, we're prepared to believe that it's very difficult and that you were sort of put in rather a difficult spot. Then also have to listen to sort of how she conducts herself, what she says about other people, and think, but perhaps you didn't make it entirely easy for yourself. And I think that that is ultimately what we need to take from this. One side will speak a lot, one side will say very little, except what they leak to the press. But you do need to remember that there are two sides, and ultimately it is unlikely that anybody has covered themselves in glory.
Zoe, do you think... I was just going to say, Zoe, do you think that the public here are more likely to be sympathetic towards Meghan now as more revelations are coming out?
Yeah, I mean, I think me and Benedict must just run in really different circles, because I haven't come across anybody who doesn't have a huge amount of sympathy for Meghan, for, the racism that is plainly legible in the British mainstream media, and the obvious relationship between the royal family and that media, which, as he says in the interview, did enable what was essentially a torrent of hate speech by the end on social media, and a huge amount of innuendo and insinuation in the tabloid media. So everybody I know thinks this is a real stain on British society, the way she was treated. And I don't think that it's nothing, the revelations about Prince William attacking his brother physically on more than one occasion. I don't think that will pass unnoticed. I don't think it is normal. Everybody, there's been an absolute pile-on in the kind of centre-right press of like sibling rivalry happens to everyone. Not in your mid-30s, it doesn't. I mean, I don't know very many people whose brothers have crashed them to the floor into a dog bowl in their mid-30s. It seems like whether the other side keeps silent and just operates with leaks or actually says anything, I don't think they're going to come away unscathed from it.
Let's move away from the royal family and Prince Harry's revelations to the Guardian, Benedict. And this to do with the NHS. The Prime Minister, we read, is looking at a one-off cash offer to end the nurses' strike. And this is further negotiations to take place starting tomorrow.
Yes, and I think ultimately, it's the first signs of the government beginning to shift, as I think everybody suspected that they would have to. You cannot be in a situation where nurses are going on strike because they've been systematically underpaid for over a decade, and just sort of throw up your hands and go, oh, well, them nurses, they're just being a bit greedy when everybody's trying to pull their socks up. I do think that it's unfortunate for the nurses that they've sort of gone on strike at the same time as other, perhaps less popular unions, but actually I don't think any public sympathy has wavered from the nurses, from the ambulance drivers, from NHS staff in general, and especially after the government set the precedent of coming and doing a deal with the Criminal Bar Association, because court cases are in some cases 3 years behind schedule. I think that there was always going to have to be some movement because the government has shown that on significant issues such as this, it has no choice. Now, obviously, I think this is just the opening gambit. They're saying it'll be a one-off payment and perhaps talking about increasing pay down the line in return for dropping demands for pay to be happening this year and reopening the previous wage settlement. Whether or not it'll be accepted, I'm not sure that it will. I think that the nurses will correctly see that as a government beginning to cave in under pressure, recognizing that it cannot be the government that finally oversees the NHS collapsing because it refused to pay nurses on wards what they needed to live on. So I think that this is just the first bit of the government moving. I think that the deal will be better than what's currently being offered.
Zoe, do you believe that this is the beginning of a breakthrough?
Well, I mean, I would never call it a breakthrough because it's such a disaster, the whole thing. It's like it's absolutely catastrophic for Sunak, the way he goes into things saying, no, I'm absolutely unbudgeable on this. I cannot move. I will not move. And then 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, he moves. It just makes him look ridiculous, and it damages his position vis-a-vis.
Does it, or does it show that he's listening?
Doesn't show he's listening at all, because the situation hasn't changed. The nurse, exactly as Benedict said, nurses have been struggling with stagnant wages for a decade, and they were everything that isn't 10% is an effective real terms wage cut. They wanted 19%. all of these facts are on the table from the very beginning of the dispute, and nothing has really changed for Sunak except that he's run out of road and he didn't think it through to begin with. So I think he's looking like a prime minister who doesn't think things through, and I think this is by no means the first time that's happened. The other thing is, there are two parallel things going on with nurses and their conditions. There's the pay dispute in one column, which is in which their case is extremely strong. But there's also the chronic underfunding as a result of not being able to recruit nurses. And therefore, their conditions at work are absolutely appalling. They're working in shifts with like 6 members of staff missing at any one time. They're overworked. They're doing 3 hours just to keep their colleagues afloat. They're really, really in crisis from a kind of long-term failure to recruit, which again has its roots in pay, but not this immediate pay battle. Now, a one-off payment for a winter crisis is not going to solve that. And everybody knows that it's not going to solve it. So unless the government comes up with something much, much better, longer term, more coherent than these kind of running just to catch up, sticking plaster approaches,
Okay.
I don't think they're going to get any political capital from it.
Zoe and Benedict, thanks so much for the moment. We're going to take a break. Coming up, this story on the front of the Daily Telegraph, which reads NHS to send 3,000 patients stuck in hospital to care homes within a week. That and more when we come back. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, writer Benedict Spence and Zoe Williams, columnist at The Guardian. We'll still continue talking about the NHS, and one of the solutions is that we read in the Daily Telegraph 3,000 patients that are stuck in hospital unnecessarily are going to be sent to care homes, and that should take place within a week, we read, Benedict.
Yes, and I think it's an incredibly important part of dealing with the multitude of crises that the NHS has. The subject of bed blocking, of course, people who are fit to be sent into care homes, but there just isn't the capacity for them, or they're needing to be sent to their homes, and that there isn't the resources for them there. And that was before we had the strikes. That was the cause of a lot of the delays and the queues in A&E. Of course, long before we had the strikes, there were talk about sort of 40% of ambulances being forced to wait because hospitals just didn't have the capacity, and a large amount of that was because of people, especially elderly and vulnerable people, not able to be discharged because there wasn't the capacity. And this is, of course, a knock-on effect. This is, of course, a knock-on issue, part of the NHS crisis. And it sort of shows how all of these things are interrelated. You can spend an awful lot of money on nurses' conditions and pay for ambulance drivers and capacity, and that still doesn't actually solve the care issue, which has sort of gone under the radar until the last few years in this country, but has really crept up on us. And this is another aspect of where this country is headed. With an aging population, you can spend as much money on the NHS, and it's going to continue to struggle if this area is not addressed. Because the population is aging, it'll always be playing catch up. And that is another area that I don't see, without building more capacity, without investing more in care home capacity, without designating more resources to that sector, I don't see long-term how we solve that. It is, again, as Zoe was alluding to in the first half of the press preview, this is a lack of long-term planning, not just about finding short-term solutions. And ultimately, it's a government that's been in power for 10, 12 years. This is something that should have been handled a long time ago. And now we have a new prime minister in the job for a matter of months, sort of scrambling to find a solution to it.
Zoe, is this a sticking plaster, or is this the future?
I mean, it's really interesting to talk about this as a problem that's crept up on the government, because this was what Theresa May came undone on in the 2017 election, was her promise to sort out social care with what then came to be known as the dementia tax. Then the idea to put up national insurance obviously came unstuck because it was going to really, really hit families who were already really struggling. So they've been... It would be one thing if any government in the past 12 years had a plan and actually carried it out, and then there was something real to discuss, who's winning and who's losing from this way of funding the care model. That would be one thing. But what we've got instead is a government that comes up with sometimes quite large schemes, sometimes quite random schemes, but they never happen because we haven't had a strong enough or competent enough or united enough Conservative Party for so long that none of this can happen. Now, the Sunak scheme to put people in care homes, you've got to remember the problem with care homes, which is that there was a huge amount of private equity takeover more than 10 years ago, and the care homes themselves are now paying rent to the the property arm of the company that owns them. So there's this kind of very complicated financial arrangement, which makes most of these care homes really, really on the edge financially, on the edge that the staff are kind of buying the biscuits for the
Zoe,
residents.
I just want to bring in your paper, actually, the Guardian, on this story, because we're running out of time, and the storming of Congress in Brazil that we've seen tonight, Benedict. The picture on the front page of The Guardian, and these are supporters of Jair Bolsonaro refusing the results of the election.
Yeah, almost 2 years to the day, in fact, since the US Capitol was stormed by supporters of former President Donald Trump. It's almost spooky. I think I mean, obviously, this is very serious. You can't have a situation where, thousands of people are storming the government buildings and, apparently doing so without police intervening or not intervening in the manner that they should have done, as happened at the US Capitol to a degree. But again, it's a situation of an election of a very large country, quite a significant country, between two wings that are not actually particularly popular, and it being quite narrow, the result. And I think that this marks the beginning of a lot of problems, actually, for Brazil. I know a lot of people were thinking after Jair Bolsonaro lost that there'd be the return of some semblance of normality to Brazil, and I don't think that that's the case at all. The majority of elected officials in Brazil actually are, if not pro-Bolsonaro, then a lot more sympathetic to him than they are to his successor.
That is worrying for the future of Brazil, indeed. Benedict and Zoe, thank you so much for taking us through the papers. We'll see you in the next hour.